District want a smaller, accountable federal government, and I know how to do that, from being a deputy county attorney in the district to being a staffer for Congressman Chris Stewart and fighting the 2nd District fights from Washington, D.C. I've been preparing to do exactly what I'm doing right now as the Congresswoman for Utah's 2nd Congressional District.
Our next question, second question, we'll direct to Ms. Malloy to begin with. If elected, you will likely be part of a very narrow minority or majority divided Congress. How would you take on the responsibility of the importance of your vote in a closely divided Congress to the benefit of the 2nd District?
Luckily, I have some experience doing this. I've been representing the 2nd District for 6 months now in a historically small majority. And even though every district only gets 1 vote, an individual can have a lot bigger influence than 1 vote. And what that requires is some experience, a lot of know-how, and the ability to build relationships and work with coalitions. So what I've been doing as the representative for this district is working with people all across the spectrum of political thought. I have introduced bills, I've co-sponsored bills, I've shown up for my colleagues on issues, and because I've done that, I've been able to get a lot more done than a freshman can usually do in their first 6 months. I have 1 vote, but I have a bigger influence in a small majority than just 1 vote because I know how Congress works and I know how to get along with people and how to work with people to get things done for the 2nd District.
Mr. Jenkins, would you like me to repeat that question for you? Okay, if elected, you will likely be part of either a very narrow majority or a very narrow minority in a closely divided Congress. How would you take on the responsibility of the importance of your votes in a closely divided Congress to the benefit of the 2nd Congressional District in Utah?
Thank you. Well, let's be clear. We have a supermajority of the American people behind us. We may have a slim majority, but that one voice can have tremendous influence and power. When that one voice in a slim majority continues to vote like my opponent has with the minority of Democrats, then that slim majority becomes nothing. Now is the time to lead. Now is the time to not surrender. Some examples. When that slim majority allows the minority to pass the $1.2 trillion omnibus spending bill that does nothing to secure our border, that sends $500 million of your taxpayer dollars to the government of Jordan to secure their border, then that's when a slim majority is failing. And the only reason it fails is because that slim majority is failing to lead. And let's ask ourselves why. When every Democrat votes yes to support the Joe Biden-Chuck Schumer policy agenda, and enough Republicans like my opponent get picked off and vote with those Democrats, then that slim majority becomes nothing. I will fight to stand with that slim majority because our American people are demanding leadership, not surrender.
Possible follow-up then would direct it to Ms. Malloy first. Knowing the situation possibly in Congress after the vote this fall, will this increase or decrease your ability to compromise?
Well, you just pointed out that we'll probably have either a slim majority or a slim minority. When you have a really narrow margin, it requires taking really tough votes. So the ability to compromise is key. And people ask me about compromise all the time. Sometimes compromise gets a bad rap. Compromise is a great thing when we're talking about matters of degree or matters of opinion. I don't compromise on matters of principle, and that increases my ability to compromise with my colleagues. They know where I stand. They know that I'm a conservative Republican. They know I represent Utah's 2nd Congressional District, and that I'm unbending on things that matter to Utah. But when it comes to whether we have a 5% cut or a 10% cut in a budget, there's some room to compromise there. And in a really closely divided Congress, compromise is required to get things done. And we just talked about having an influence. When people know you're willing to show up, you're willing to have the conversation, then you have that influence and you're part of the conversation about compromise. When you're unbending, you're not invited to the table.
Mr. Jenkins, knowing the scenarios that we just painted, a minority versus a majority in Congress, again, would this increase or decrease your ability to compromise?
So there's some key differences that were just highlighted. What you heard was exactly the reason why we have a $35, now almost $36 trillion deficit. There's a difference between compromise and negotiate. I will stand on and defend the Constitution on the constitutional platform, and within those protective boundaries of the Constitution, I will negotiate all day. I will reach across the aisle and build relationships of trust. But I will not compromise on the Constitution. I will not compromise on why you are hiring me to control government spending, to secure and close our border, and to limit our national debt, which is out of control. My opponent has surrendered on those issues time and time again. $1.2 trillion, I've said that multiple times now. The Democrats succeeded in passing that because they had Republicans like my opponent who stepped away from the majority Republicans and voted with the minority. That's called surrender. That's not called compromise. We must lead. The American people are hungry and demanding for us to lead. They're tired of surrender. They're tired of Republicans who vote with the Democrats and surrender on good, conservative Republican values.
The two key issues that keep coming up during this campaign are one, inflation, and the second is immigration. So let's talk about immigration first. Congress has been unable to reach agreement on immigration reform for decades now. A comprehensive, negotiated bipartisan reform package was defeated, as we know, earlier this year. What would you do to address the immigration issue? Would you support bipartisan legislation to solve this crisis? We begin with Mr. Jenkins.
It begins with leadership. I will vote for and support President Trump and the new Trump administration. I've voted for President Trump before, and I will vote for him now. I look forward to and hope there's a question about who supports President Trump between us, who has voted for him, and who will stand with him when he takes office and looks to the legislators around him and asks, who's with me? Who has been with me? So it's leadership. As a legislator, it's my opportunity to remove legislative obstacles to make sure that the new Trump administration can be successful. An example of where it's not successful is when we have Republicans, like my opponent, who continue to vote for omnibus, out-of-control spending and send $500 million of your taxpayer money to the government of Jordan to secure their border and call securing our border creating new processing facilities. So think about that. New processing facilities so that our border guards can now more efficiently and quickly subsidize and process illegal immigrants into our country. That's not securing our border. That's not what I will do.
Ms. Malloy, would you like me to repeat the question, or are you okay?
No, I can remember the question. So we do need immigration reform. Our border is a mess. I've been to the border twice in the short time I've been in office. And what I saw both times, once in Texas, once in Arizona, is that we have law enforcement that's overwhelmed. We're not in control of our border at the moment. And any immigration discussion has to start with the border. We have to get our border under control before we decide how to fix legal immigration, which does need to be fixed. What I saw in Arizona specifically was local law enforcement trying to do the job the federal government should be doing. So what I want is to have President Trump back in the White House. We know how to control our border. It was under control 4 years ago. It's out of control now. The thing that changed is the administration. It's not a funding issue at our border. It's a matter of political will. It's a matter of being willing to enforce the laws that are already in place. We know that President Trump has the political will to do it, and I look forward to supporting him when he does that.
This is, yes.
So can I get just a brief rebuttal? So I would argue that it is a matter of funding. It is a matter of political will and leadership on the border. President Trump, when he takes office, he wants people who will not undermine him. He wants people who will not send our taxpayer dollars to fund and control the borders of other nations. We need leadership at the border, and we need legislators who are willing to stand up and defend our border. I'm a combat veteran. I do not need to go to the border to know that we're being invaded. What we need is leadership, we need funding, and we need leaders who will stand up and remove those obstacles instead of shipping our taxpayer dollars to other countries to secure their borders. Ms.
Malloy, you have 30 seconds to respond to that if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly rebut that. So there's a false equivalency being used here between the Jordanian border and our border. Remember a few weeks ago when Iran sent a swarm of drones to Israel, and we were all holding our breath to see if they just started World War III? Jordan shot down a lot of those drones. They play an important role, and their border plays an important role in keeping peace in the world and in a proxy war that we don't want coming to our shores. Supporting Jordan and their border is called leadership. We do need leadership. It's not something that's robbing from our border. Our border could be secure at the same time we're supporting Jordan if we had a president who would enforce the laws that are already on the books.
But imagine if we had $500 million at our border. Let's start with America first. The American people are demanding and craving leadership. They're tired of Republicans who put America last. That's what we're here for, to be hired to defend and fight for our country, to send money and defend our border, not the borders of other nations. Certainly we need to have defense in depth, but let's start with America first. That's what you're hiring me to do, not rationalize the defense of our security away from our nation.
Ms. Malloy, your response to that?
My opponent just said that wasn't a funding issue at the border and then said we needed $500 million at the border. The truth is, Congress could send as much money as it wants to the border right now, and until President Biden decides that it's actually a priority and instructs the people who work for him to enforce the laws we already have at the border, it's not a funding issue. In fact, when I voted for funding at the border, my opponent accused me of funding more coddling of people who shouldn't come across the border. What we need is political will at our border and to be a good ally to our allies in the Middle East.
More processing facilities is exactly coddling. It's subsidizing immigration.
Let's continue on the topic of immigration, but a follow-up on that. Mr. Jenkins, do you support President Biden's recent executive action that will temporarily shut down asylum requests each day once the daily encounters reach 2,500 between official ports of entries? Do you support his executive action?
I support leadership. That's not the type of leadership that we need. Think about that. 2,500 illegal. Us saying that that's okay. Our leadership saying, hey, we can let in 2,500 more illegal immigrants, and then maybe we'll wake up and take action. That's not leadership. That's continued surrender. That's not what we're being hired to do. President Trump demonstrated that leadership. What we need to do is roll back or put back in place policies that we had before. Remain in Mexico in the catch and release. Turn off those incentives that are attracting such illegal immigration in droves. So what we need is not the type of leadership that President Biden is showing. We need leadership that President Trump had before, and legislators who will stand up and be there with him and make sure that the policies that he wants to create and that the legislature can support actually take effect.
Ms. Malloy, where do you stand on President Biden's executive action?
No, I don't support his executive action. I think this is a cynical political move. I think he's seen the same polls that we've all seen that show that Republicans, Democrats, Independents all agree that the border's out of control and that this administration is failing us when it comes to treating us like we're a sovereign nation. So he's taking a half measure to try to get credit without offending his base. So he's saying that he's going to take executive action at the border, but what he's doing is still allowing people to come across the border. What we need is an actual control of the border. We need a leader in the White House who's willing to take real steps, take criticism for it, and stand strong in securing our border. That isn't what's happening right now with President Biden.
All right, let's move on to a different topic. The American people have seen very large bills covering an array of issues, both budget issues, bills in Congress. If you agree with the majority of the policies in a bill, but disagree with other portions of the bill, would you vote against it or vote in support as a compromise? Let's say in sports terminology, is it better to hit a single or a double rather than a grand slam?
Is this my question?
Yes, directed to you.
I mean, I'm not very athletic, but even I know it's better to hit a grand slam. I also know that you can't hit a grand slam every single play. And I think the mistake we make sometimes as conservatives is that we want a grand slam every time, so we'll pass on singles and doubles. Part of the reason we have the bloated federal government we have now is that Democrats are willing to take a single every time, and they're willing to keep racking up runs and run up the score. As a general rule, I would like to see us voting on bills that are individual bills where we're voting on one issue at a time. The reality in a really closely divided government is you have to take tough votes sometimes. And I've taken some tough votes in the short time I've been in Congress, and what I've done is come back and explain to people in Utah why I've taken the votes, what the wins are in those votes, and why they're what's best for Utah's 2nd Congressional District. And by the way, that's called leadership. Leadership isn't throwing out ultimatums or talking points. Leadership's getting in, doing the work, and being accountable for the work you're doing.
Mr. Jenkins, would you like me to repeat that question, or are you okay?
I'm good. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you. So
your response.
Sticking with the metaphor of baseball and singles and doubles. Yes, the Democrats have been hitting singles and doubles and scoring for the last 3.5 years. And the only reason they've succeeded in doing that is because our slim majority has allowed them to do that. The $1.2 trillion omnibus spending bill, Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, who did not secure our border, the only way that passed is because every Democrat voted yes for it. And they were able to pick off just enough Republicans to join them, like my opponent, Celeste Malloy. Not once, but twice. So hitting singles and doubles is one thing, but when you're hitting them for the wrong team, that's another. That's called surrender. That is not called leadership. The American people are with us. There is a supermajority of Americans who are looking to us, Republicans, to stand up and own that slim majority. Imagine this. Let's stand up and actually fight for the values and the budget that we want, instead of hitting singles and doubles and compromising with the minority time and time again. Imagine getting back on the winning side when you actually are in the majority. That's what leadership is about. That's what you're hiring me to do, not cave and surrender and hit singles and doubles for the wrong team.
Ms. Malloy, do you have a response?
Yeah, I'm going to rebut. I'd like to talk about leadership when it comes to spending bills. So when the government reaches the end of its funding, we have three options: continuing resolution, spending bill, which is a budget, or a shutdown. Continuing resolution was a non-starter for me. That's continuing the Nancy Pelosi Congress's priorities. A shutdown means we're trying to come out of a shutdown at some point in a weak bargaining position, negotiating with Democrat Senate, Democrat White House. I chose the most fiscally responsible option, which is a spending bill, and it is, by the way, an overall cut in spending and has really important conservative policy riders in it. It was a tough vote, and I came back and explained it, but it is the best option of the three options we had in front of us.
Mr. Jenkins, 30 seconds.
Our district is tired of explanations. They're tired of rationalization. They're tired of surrender. Leadership is about standing up. Those are false choices. That's exactly why we are in a $35, now almost $36 trillion debt. That is exactly the establishment talking to you. Now imagine this. Why is it? Why are those the choices? It's not the choice of Nancy Pelosi's CR, or we pass the budget that the Democrats want, or we shut down the government. Let's actually stand up and pass the budget that we want, that we're being hired to actually pass. And if the Democrats don't want that, let's force them to shut down the government. But let's begin by leading and not surrendering.
Our next question is a video question. It comes to us from our criminal justice major at Southern Utah University. His name is Sebastian Zuninga, and the response first will be to Mr. Jenkins. Here's the video question.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Zuniga, and I'm a criminal justice major at Southern Utah University. During my time over there, I have realized that Cedar City relies on water sources such as watersheds instead of reservoirs. So, my question to you is that how can you ensure that areas like Cedar City will have a steady source of water in the years to come? Thank you.
Mr. Jenkins.
So in our second district, next to closing the border and securing the border, the number one priority is fighting for and securing our water and our land. Our voters are not hiring me just to participate in this process. They're hiring me to lead. They're hiring me to fight and push back against the federal government, the bureaucracy, the overreach that's coming into our district time and time again. As I meet with local leaders, our county commissioners, they're just praying for and looking forward to the opportunity to work with the President Trump administration and have a change in the BLM primarily. But what they're also looking for is leadership. How can we trust our leader, our representative, who time and time again votes with the Democrats on their priorities instead of standing up and voting for our priorities? So let's think about that. Overlaying her record on how she will fight for our water and land, what's a bill going to look like? Are we going to get 4 wins for the Democrats because she's used to voting with the Democrats in the minority, and only 2 wins for us? That's the type of incrementalism that you are not hiring me for. We want positive change in our direction and stop the incremental change in the direction of the Democrats.
Ms. Malloy, your response to the questions about water in southern Utah.
Yeah, so first of all, go T-Birds. I always love to see one of the students from my alma mater getting involved in politics. Secondly, I live in Cedar City. I have a pretty high incentive to want to see good water planning, water policy happening in places like Cedar City. And this is where experience really matters. If you look at my resume, if you look at my work experience, you'll see that I've spent the majority of my life working in natural resources policy and specifically in water. A lot of people think they're water experts right now, and I actually am one. But this is a tricky question because water belongs to the state. The Utah Constitution specifically says that the water in Utah belongs to the state of Utah and the people. And as a federal representative, I'm very careful about that line. I have done a lot of water policy in my life, but I try not to get ahead of the state in their water planning. Right now, the state of Utah, the counties, the local governments are doing a really good job of looking forward and planning for long-term water policy. And my job as a representative is to support them and make sure that they have help getting through federal permitting and getting federal money when they need it. That's what I do because that's the right lane for your federal representative to be in.
Just one quick
yes, 30 seconds.
So this is a question, a contrast in being a bureaucrat and leadership. Leadership matters in this issue. for someone who has supposed tremendous experience in this area, then she should have recognized that the person who did the most for us in water and land for Utah was President Trump. And knowing that, you should have been the first to vote for him and support him. And I look forward to, hopefully there's a question about, did you vote for President Trump in the last election? At what point did you actually begin supporting him in this election? If you truly want to fight for water and land in Utah, you vote for and you support President Trump. You don't just come home and rationalize and explain away why you're hitting singles and doubles for the Democrats.
Next question has to deal with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, the extension bill. Yeah. It would continue to provide aid to downwinders, but it expired this past week. The House Speaker did not bring it to the floor of the House. Both Utah senators have voted against a bill extending it, citing its proposed expansion to cover more people and the additional $50 billion price tag. What is your position on the program extension? And we begin with Ms. Malloy.
So I'm going to correct the premise of your question, first of all. So there's more than one bill for RECA extension. RECA is really important in the 2nd District especially. When we were doing above-ground testing of nuclear weapons in Nevada, those mushroom clouds came right over the 2nd District, and families in Utah are still being impacted by that. It's important that we make sure this gets extended. The bill in the Senate that you said has the $50 billion price tag is not just an extension, it's an expansion to cover different kinds of exposure that should be handled separately. Different fact pattern, different situation, they should be handled separately. I have a clean extension, which means we just extend the program as is, that I introduced with Senator Leaf. So there's a Senate companion, a House companion, and I've been working with Jim Jordan, who's the chair of Judiciary, which that bill goes through, and I've been working with Speaker Johnson to make sure we get that to the floor for a vote. There's also a bill out of Wyoming that marries up downwinders with uranium miners, and that could also move. But what we need is a right-sized bill to make sure that Utahns are protected, and that's what I introduced.
Mr. Jenkins, your thoughts on the Radiation Exposure Compensation Bill?
Yes, similar to with our promises to our veterans, we must honor promises that we've made, our government has made, to those who've been affected by our actions and by answering the call for, like she alluded to the testing and the effects of that. But here's where we roll back to, how can we trust the leadership and the rationalization of my opponent when she continues to put our priorities, our conservative Republican spending priorities, on the back burner to what the minority party is demanding? If we want a clean bill, what does that clean bill look like? How many of our Republican priorities are going to be in that have not been compromised to the minority Democrats? So back again where I began with, we have a supermajority of American people on our side. We have a slim majority, but we need to stand up and lead. We cannot lead from a position of weakness by continual compromise, stepping away from Republican values that allow our principles to no longer have a seat at the table. And so that's why we're continuing to lose these types of battles, because that leadership does not begin from a position of strength. Instead, it begins from a position of hitting singles and doubles for the other team.
Ms. Malloy, do you have a response?
Yeah, just a quick lesson on what a clean reauthorization means. It means it reauthorizes the program exactly as it is. There are no other priorities thrown into the bill for 2 years. It would reauthorize the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and take care of the downwinders in Utah exactly the way it's been. The bill out of the Senate has a lot of other priorities in it, way too big of a spending price tag. That's why that bill can't pass. It's collapsing under its own weight. And what I'm working with leadership and with my colleagues in the Senate on is a clean reauthorization.
Mr. Jenkins, a response.
So once again, I question and I do not trust her voting record speaks for how she has represented us and the types of bills and compromises that she is willing to take. When you vote not once, but twice for the Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer omnibus spending packages, that's not what Republicans are being hired to do. When you vote not once, but twice for warrantless wiretaps on U.S. persons, that's not what Republicans are being hired to do. So I question the leadership and the ability for her to bring bills to us that are actually worthy of Republican values.
Candidates, thank you very much for your answers so far. We have now reached the halfway point of the debate. Once again, debate featuring Republican primary candidates in Utah's 2nd Congressional District, Colby Jenkins and Celeste Malloy. Once again, I'm Rod Arquette. We encourage you to submit questions during this live broadcast. Use the hashtag UT Debates on social media. Now, let's get back to the debate. We begin with a question to Mr. Jenkins first. The Northern Corridor is a proposed 4-lane, 50-mile-per-hour highway that would be constructed through Red Cliffs National Conservation Area and would connect northwest and northeast St. George. Please tell us why you either support or oppose the Northern Corridor. Mr. Jenkins.
I support the Northern Corridor. I live in the Northern Corridor. Unlike my opponent, I actually live there, and I own a home, and I pay taxes. I'm actually a resident in Washington County in St. George. So I look forward to that becoming a reality. This is a prime example of federal government overreach. This opportunity was actually on its way to fruition and to reality until the Joe Biden administration came into power. And that's when the BLM, the new director of the BLM, and all the agencies that are impacting the Northern Corridor process put the brakes on, and now caused us to spend more unnecessary taxpayer dollars to put this into oblivion, essentially. And so now what we need to do is have leadership. We need, again, President Trump back in the White House, a new director of the BLM who's going to look around and say, who's with me? Who's with me? Who's going to actually work for the people back in your district? And they're going to look to their left and right, and they're going to see a combat veteran. They're going to see somebody who actually voted for President Trump and somebody who has not hit singles and doubles, once again, for the Democrats time and time again. That's the kind of trust that the new Trump administration, the new director of the BLM, and our local leaders are looking for so that that Northern Corridor can actually become a reality.
Ms. Malloy, your position on the Northern Corridor.
My position on the Northern Corridor has been very clear from the beginning. I don't know that there's anybody who has more experience working to get that road permitted than I do. I worked on it as a deputy county attorney in Washington County. And speaking of the Trump administration and their green lighting of the project, I was the person pushing that process as a political staffer. And the question has been raised whether I can work with the Trump administration, how long I've supported him. President Trump's Secretary of Interior, David Bernhardt, endorsed me in this race because of the work we did on issues like the Northern Corridor when he was in office. And that's only one of two cabinet-level endorsements I have out of the Trump administration. So I think that can put that question to rest. And as far as the Northern Corridor goes, it is a prime example of what's wrong with the bureaucracy in our country. It's a road that the local governments have known they needed for years, have been working on for years, even went to the federal government and compromised to get. And the only reason we're still talking about it years and years later is because of inefficiency and bureaucracy in the federal permitting process. And that's something I'm uniquely positioned to strip down and make simpler so that Utahns don't have so much federal government interference in their day-to-day lives.
Mr. Jenkins, you have a response.
Yeah, so two points of clarification. So before the special election last year, you were actually part of that bureaucracy. You were part of that bureaucracy. Before that, at what point did you actually start supporting President Trump? Was it after Nikki Haley dropped out of the race or before? It's okay to have people who are on his staff level representing him, but when you fail to lead and actually stand up and support the President of the United States, President Trump, and say that you're going to endorse him and work with him until it's convenient, then that's not leadership. And that's not what our local leaders are looking for. And that's not what the Trump administration will be looking for when he wins.
Ms. Malloy, you have 30 seconds to respond.
Yeah, so I think the best way to tell who's supportive of someone is what the people closest to them are saying. The people closest to Trump endorsed me in this race. I said all along I'd support the nominee. Trump's the nominee. I support him. I worked well with him before. In fact, during his administration, I could walk into the Department of Interior, get a meeting with a cabinet-level secretary, and fix problems for our local elected officials, which is why I have a really long list of local elected officials who are endorsing me. They've worked with me. They've seen the work I do to clear red tape for them, and they want me to be able to keep doing that for the people of the 2nd District.
And that's why the Northern Corridor remains in limbo.
Let's move on to another topic. Our favorite topic. Let's talk about taxes, if we could. The personal income tax cuts passed by Congress in 2017, commonly known as the Trump tax cuts, will expire in 2025. Do you favor the extension of these cuts? Why or why not? And we begin with Ms. Malloy.
I favor the extension of the Trump tax cuts, and I'm excited to be there while we're talking about the new tax bill, because we've got to make sure that more money stays in Americans' pockets. With inflation and spending, we need Utahns to keep as much of their money and invest it the way they want as they possibly can. We need the tax rate to be low and the tax base to be broad so that everybody has buy-in and everybody can afford to live in this country. We also need a simpler tax code so that the average American knows what their tax burden is, and people aren't getting themselves in trouble because our tax code's so complicated that the average person can't understand it, can't do their own taxes.
Mr. Jenkins.
Yes, I support the tax break extension for sure. But this is where a clear contrast is in the choice that you have in our race. You have someone who's going to stand up and actually fight with and stay on our slim majority, actually seek to govern. When we talk about debt, when we talk about inflation, when we talk about taxes, the American people have empowered us, the slim majority of Republicans, to actually stand up and fight for them, not cede ground to the minority party and roll with them to pass their budget and pass their priorities. So how are we going to secure these tax breaks? How are we going to make sure that your paycheck goes farther instead of going less and less and less, and you feeling the pressures of inflation? Well, we're going to do that by stopping the passage of $1.2 trillion omnibus examples over and over again. When we have Republicans in the Congress who continue to do that, then there's going to be little benefit to the tax breaks that we get, because we will continue to feel the pressures of generational debt and inflation that we continue to buckle under. We must stand up and lead as Republicans and not surrender.
Let's move on to another topic now. Let's talk about health care in America today. As we know, cost for all Americans is going up, including many Utahns here. We've seen them rise dramatically. What would you do as a member of Congress to reduce health care costs? Mr. Jenkins, you have the opportunity to respond first.
Similarly with other principles we've talked about, where we have made promises, we must honor those promises. But similar with our non-discretionary buckets of spending, Social Security, Medicare, and on it goes, we must look to privatization. We must look to where the market can actually come in and actually help us. We must remove boundaries that the federal government has in place that cause an imbalance in how Medicare, how medical services can truly be provided. So the more that we can remove government, the more that we can increase privatization and the powers of the market, the better. But an important thing to remember here as well is that the one bucket that we can do a little better at controlling is the interest on the debt. The interest on our debt is quickly overcoming how much we spend on our defense. Interest, spending more on that than the own defense of our nation. We can control that by spending less, by stop voting for omnibus spending packages over and over. I sound like a broken record, but the American people are demanding that. They're tired of reckless spending that contributes to the pressures of debt and inflation that don't even allow us to get to proper medical coverage.
Ms. Malloy, what about the concern Americans have on the cost of health care? What would you do as a member of Congress to reduce those costs?
This is a huge concern. When I'm out talking to people in Utah, I hear a similar story from a lot of our seniors, that they lived within their means, they saved for retirement, they own their homes, they've done exactly what they were supposed to do, and the thing that they couldn't have accounted for is how much their prescriptions cost now, and it's eating into their fixed income. I've worked a lot with the independent pharmacists in Utah, and they face a similar problem to what we have in the government. There's too much bureaucracy in the healthcare system. There are middlemen between the patient and the prescription provider who are running up costs, and it's hurtful to the small businesses in Utah that are anchors to the main streets in our small towns. It's also hurtful to the people who need the prescriptions. So what we need to do is simplify this process so that people who have worked hard, paid their way, saved up, aren't going broke in retirement because they can't afford their prescriptions. We need to apply the same thing even to privatized healthcare that we're talking about in government. Remove a lot of the red tape, remove a lot of the middlemen, and have healthcare decisions be made between patients, doctors, and providers.
So we must ask ourselves, why are those paychecks from the fixed income going less and less? Why are they not going as far as they used to? Generational debt, inflation. Where does that come from? It comes from members of Congress who continue to pass omnibus, out-of-control spending bills. Those members of Congress who have done that during this most recent history are every Democrat who voted yes for both omnibus bills and my opponent. Not once, but twice. So yes, prescription drugs are becoming more expensive, but those paychecks aren't going as far because our leadership continues to give them a bill of goods that they cannot afford.
Ms. Malloy, 30 seconds to respond.
I'm going to rebut that because the problem with government spending is the spending that happens outside of the appropriations process. During the last Congress, when we didn't have a majority in the House, we passed huge spending bills like the IIJA and the ironically named Inflation Reduction Act. The bill he keeps talking about that I voted for is a budget, and it was a cut. So what we need is for Congress to be spending money through the appropriations process and cutting back every year, which is what we're doing, and not passing these big outside of the appropriations spending bills. Those do cause inflation, and the only thing standing between us and those kind of bills right now is the slim majority in the House of Representatives that I'm part of.
Let's move on to another topic now.
Can I just get one brief point on the cuts?
Very quickly.
So this is a perfect example of Washington, D.C. math. When you expect to gain 10 pounds, but you only gain 8, that's not a cut. You still gained 8 pounds. That's the precise reason why we are now in 35, now almost $36 trillion of debt, because of those cuts that legislators like my opponent continue to justify on your backs. Those are not cuts. Let us be clear, those are not cuts. And that slim majority will not exist as long as we do not govern as a slim majority.
Ms. Malloy, you have 20 seconds.
They are, in fact, cuts. And one of the most important things to note about that bill, a minibus bill, and the cuts, is that we broke the parity between defense and non-defense spending. So the non-defense cuts are actually quite large, and we increased defense spending, which is important because China's outspending us in military technology. So we not only moved to catch up with China, but also ended up with an overall cut while doing that.
All right, let's move on to another topic now.
$36 trillion in debt. How's that a cut?
With the Dobbs case, the U.S. Supreme Court returned the regulation of abortion to the states. However, we have seen recent debate that there should be a federal legislation on this issue of abortion. Would you support legislation that allowed abortion up to 15 weeks? Why or why not? We begin with Ms. Malloy.
Yeah, I've been consistent on this one. I am unapologetically pro-life. I wouldn't support any legislation that allows abortion. I am supportive of the Dobbs decision and this being returned to the states. If there's a federal bill banning abortion, I'm not going to pass the opportunity to vote in favor of banning abortion. But I want it left to the states. I think the states are better at making these decisions. But too often we get caught up in these debates over how many weeks and what the exceptions are. And I think as Republicans, we do this a lot. Instead of staying focused on the end goal, we get caught up in the short-term debate. The end goal is we want to protect life. And that's where I am. I'm all in on the end goal of protecting life.
Mr. Jenkins, your thoughts on a national ban on abortion or 15 weeks? Where do you stand?
I support life. I protect life just like I've protected this nation with my life. It's important that we do that. I support our Constitution. The Constitution and our method of federalism right now has the abortion laws pushed down to the states, and that's where it needs to be right now. That's the law of the land. But let's take a closer look at the contrast again that you have in the choice before you. My opponent says she will not support legislation that supports abortion, when in fact that's exactly what she did in the most recent $1.2 trillion Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer omnibus. Just like in every spending bill, there is always what's called the Hyde Amendment. That's gone back, and that's been in every appropriations bill for decades. That specifically prevents federal funding from funding an abortion. But what government doesn't tell you in the establishment is what happened in this bill. More than $2 million went to a clinic that performs late-term abortions to make sure they have the most standard, up-to-date equipment. On and on we go. So you can say that you don't support legislation that supports abortion when, in fact, you supported a spending bill that provided more than multiple millions of dollars to late-term abortion clinics. That's not protecting life.
Ms. Malloy, your response.
It's naive to think that the Hyde Amendment is an automatic amendment that goes into every spending bill. Republicans work and fight for that every year, and particularly this year, right after Roe v. Wade was overturned, the Hyde Amendment was a big fight. And that's a big win for America that the Hyde Amendment's in this bill. There was an earmark in that bill that I don't like, that my opponent also doesn't like. Had we not let the bill pass and we'd have had to negotiate to come out of a shutdown with a Democrat Senate, there would have been a lot more earmarks and riders in a big omnibus to end a shutdown than we had in a bill that was actually negotiated by the Speaker of the House, not just by Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden.
So once again, pattern of rationalization, pattern of surrender. If you fought for the Hyde Amendment, then fight for life. Fight to say it's not okay to have multiple millions of dollars going to a clinic that performs late-term abortion. Put that bill on the Democrats. It's not our job to fund the government. It's our job to control spending. If the Democrats want to close the government, then that's their call. We stand up and fight for our Republican conservative values. And one of those is life. It's not rationalization. It's not saying it's okay to do earmarks and cave into the Democrats. It's actually standing up and leading. That's what we're being hired to do.
Candidates, we have about 8 minutes now to the closing statement. Let's move on to another topic. Depending on who you talk to, anywhere from 65% to 70% of land here in the state of Utah is controlled by the federal government. One of the long-standing arguments, of course, between the state and the federal government is the management of those federal lands. How do you propose to negotiate and improve those federal and state relationships in the future? We begin with Mr. Jenkins.
Yeah, it begins with leadership, and I've said this multiple times, and that leadership is President Trump. We need to get him back in office so that we can return to the better days of our water and land that we had under his administration. Once he gets into administration and we have a new director of the BLM, we have a new director of the EPA, and the whole tenor and tone of management of our lands changes, those people, those new teammates are going to look to us, our Utah legislators, and say, who's with us? Who's with us? Who voted for us? Who's with us from the beginning? And that's me. That's a clear contrast in the choice you have before you. I voted for President Trump twice before. I voted for him in this year's primary, and I will vote for him again. That type of unwavering support, not the desire to undermine, as Republicans have done in the past, or to hold your cards and wait till it's clear that you can support him, like my opponent has done. That's not what's going to allow us to negotiate effectively and proactively and positively on behalf of our lands and water with the new Trump administration.
Ms. Malloy, let's talk about federal lands and the relationship between the state and federal government.
We need structural change. The relationship between the state and the federal government is broken in a lot of areas, and federal land's probably one of the easiest examples to cite in this state. The federal government is overreaching its authority every day, and Congress has historically delegated that authority and not taken it back. It's time to take that authority back so that it doesn't matter who's in the White House. Utah still has say over what happens on its land. I'm working with my colleagues right now to make sure that we pull back some of that authority and make sure that federal agencies know that they don't have the authority to do whatever they want on our land. And it's exciting right now because the Supreme Court looks like it might be willing to overturn the Chevron case that says the court will defer to agencies in the absence of clarity from Congress. So this is the time to have people in Congress who understand federalism, separation of powers, and the proper role of the legislative branch and the executive branch. What we don't need is things flipping back and forth every time we get a new occupant in the White House.
Mr. Jenkins, your response.
So how do we control the federal bureaucracy when we continue to fund them? Giving the FBI $200 million like you did in the last omnibus spending package is not a way to rein in or control the FBI. $200 million. And other earmarks, on and on it goes. It's important that we as Republicans stand up and take back that power that has been ceded to the fourth branch of government by Republicans who continue to vote with the minority and not stand and govern as a slim majority. The American people are hungry for leadership. They're demanding that we stand up and stop ceding to the minority, and we actually try and win.
Do you have a response, Ms. Malloy?
I mean, the question from my opponent was, how do we strip down the federal government if we keep funding the government? And the answer is the Constitution actually requires the House of Representatives to pass spending bills to fund the government. But what we need is a right-sized government. And we always talk about it when we're passing the budget, but it's got to start before that. We've got to get rid of the things that our government's doing that it shouldn't be doing. And then we're funding the appropriate size of federal government. We need a smaller, more accountable, more responsive federal government. And now's the time to do that because right now, even Democrats in Congress are saying that we need less government.
Mr. Jenkins.
How are we making government smaller when we continue to fund the Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer $1.2 trillion omnibus spending package? Imagine if Republicans who had the majority, we still have the majority, imagine if they had stood up and said no. Simply no. But yes to a budget that we support, that actually decreases federal spending, that actually decreases the overreach of federal government. That's not what happened this year. That's not what my opponent has voted for, not once, but twice has she done that. That's not okay, and that's not what you're hiring me to do.
Ms. Malloy, you have 30 seconds.
So funding a government through a bill that was negotiated by Mike Johnson, the most conservative Speaker of the House we've had in our lifetime, is not the same thing as ceding to Democrats. And anyone who tells you that they will negotiate, but then goes out on the campaign trail and trashes the Speaker of the House is naive about how much they're going to be able to get done in Congress when they're fighting their own team and insulting their own team. The House and the Senate are different. The Senate's in the minority right now. We have the majority in the House, and it's important that we show the American people that we can govern.
One quick.
Jenkins?
That's exactly the establishment for you. Circling the gravy train wagons, protecting their own, because business as usual is business as usual. How many of you are tired of business as usual? How many of you are tired of someone who will say, hey, I'll just get in line and do what you tell me to do? That's not what you are hiring me to do. You are hiring me to be your voice and to stand up to the Speaker of the House if that's what it needs to be. You bet. You are hiring me to stand up and fight for you, not take a number and get in line and say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, to the Speaker of the House. That's not what you're hiring me to do.
30 seconds.
Well, he's right about one thing. Nobody should ever get in line and just do what leadership tells them. I've voted against continuing resolutions that came out of leadership, but they always heard it from me first. Leadership is taking the tough votes on behalf of your constituents, owning those votes, explaining those votes, and being consistent. That's what you've gotten from me for 6 months. That's what you'll get from me in a full term. Not talking points, not red meat. You will get leadership, tough votes, and accountability.
All right, we've got 3 minutes before the closing arguments, but let's talk for just those 3 minutes about trade. Both President Biden and former President Trump have proposed placing tariffs on Chinese goods. These tariffs would have the impact of raising consumer prices here at home. What is your position on leveling tariffs against China? Ms. Malloy.
During the last administration, we tried tariffs against China, and it was actually pretty effective. Generally speaking, I don't like using tariffs to try to level the playing field because it increases the cost of goods. But right now, China's a bad actor on the world stage, and they need to know that we're serious about standing up to them. So I would support going back to the tariffs we had during the last administration. And we've also got to increase our military technology and make sure China knows that they're negotiating against a strong America. We'll get peace through strength, and we don't project strength onto the world stage when we're not investing in our military and our military technology.
Mr. Jenkins.
Yeah, the fewer times that the government can be in the business of picking winners and losers, the better. But in this case, China has certainly gotten ahead of us, and that stems directly back to a failure of leadership. We need, again, President Trump back in the office so that we can level that playing field and make sure that our U.S. industries, our businesses, can actually compete without having to take their lumps from the Chinese government. But let's ask ourselves, why is China eating our lunch? Why are they owning more of our border than we do? Well, that's because we've failed to secure our border. When we continue to send money to secure the borders of other nations, we send China a clear and distinct message. Come and take our lunch money. China looks at our border as the smokeless battlefield. They continue to infiltrate the precursors to fentanyl that are killing our American youth by the tens of thousands without even pulling a trigger. That's why our American people are tired of legislators, tired of politicians who will continue to compromise on putting America first. You are hiring me to stand up, close the border, and secure it for you, not send money or compromise on what America needs first.
Final question for you. We have just a minute to go before closing statements. This question keeps on coming up during the debate. So we'll begin. Who do you plan to vote for in the 2024 presidential election? Mr. Jenkins.
So I've answered this question throughout. I voted for President Trump twice before. I voted for him in this year's primary, and I will vote for him again. And I look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with the Trump administration over and over again. Some of the difficulties that President Trump had during his first administration is because he continued to encounter Republicans who were content in undermining him and making sure that his agenda, like repealing Obamacare, there were senators, one in particular, who voted against President Trump and defeated that effort to repeal Obamacare.
Mr. Jenkins, we need to move on. Ms. Malloy would like your response to that. Who will you vote for in the 2024 election?
I'm going to vote for Donald J. Trump. I've been consistent in saying I'll support the Republican nominee, and that's exactly what I intend to do. And I also look forward to working shoulder to shoulder with his administration like I've done before.
We now have reached the end of the debate this afternoon. A random drawing held earlier determined that the first closing statement would go to Ms. Malloy. And now, Celeste Malloy, your closing remark.
Thank you. I'm your Congresswoman for the 2nd Congressional District. I started this journey a year ago, and it was an improbable journey. I'm not somebody who's always sought political office, but I am someone who's always sought to serve and sought to do the work. I was at an event recently where somebody said, you should decide who to vote on by seeing who's been involved all along, and that's me. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't headed for Congress, but we need more Utah and DC. And I am as 2nd District as someone can get. I have been working with the people at the grassroots in the 2nd District my entire adult life. You know what you're going to get from me because I've already demonstrated that I will be transparent, I'll be accountable, I'll be on the ground, I'll be very active. I show up for the people of the 2nd District, and I hope they'll show up for me because I am just getting started on making sure that we have a loud voice in Washington for a smaller, more accountable government. I have a long list of endorsements of people who've actually worked with me, who know me, who've seen what I'm capable of, who can vouch for the time that I've spent making sure the people in the 2nd District have a better life. So please go to my website, celesteforutah.com, look at what I've been doing, and I look forward to getting your support and to representing this district for a full term.
Thank you very much. Now, Colby Jenkins, your closing remarks.
As I've been on the campaign trail over and over again, I get asked, what gives you hope? Why would you even want to do this? And when people ask me about hope, it reminds me of the hope that I have in my life. Shortly before I went to combat in Afghanistan, our 2nd daughter was born. In fact, 3 weeks later, I deployed to combat. And Heather and I, my wife, we named her Olivia Hope, in the hope that I would return, in the hope that I would survive combat and actually come home and be able to be her father. Now that same daughter, Olivia, is at West Point, and she's wearing our nation's cloth. Her and her generation are looking to us for leadership, judgment, and accountability. When people ask me, what gives me hope? Well, I have literally hope in my life, but I have hope in a greater future. I have hope because I've fought for this nation. I've bled for this nation, and I have people on the ground who've died for this nation.
Mr. Jenkins, 10 seconds.
Whose service I hope to honor and will always honor. If you're tired of business as usual, then vote for me. Please join our A-team and go to our website, colby4utah.com. And thank you for your support.
Thank you. Colby Jenkins and Celeste Malloy, thank you very much for participating today and for your dedication to public service. Election Day is Tuesday, June 25th. Contact your county clerk if you have any questions about making your vote count in this election. We greatly appreciate PBS Utah for donating the production facilities to broadcast this debate. We also are grateful to the Larry H. and Gail Miller Family Foundation, Zions Bank, the George S. and Dolores Story Eccles Foundation, and the Stewart Family Foundation for their generous support of the Utah Debate Commission. This debate and others from previous years are available online at utahdebatecommission.org. I'm Rod Arquette. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.
Now, is this being filmed, or am I just speaking? Hey, nice to see you. It's been a minute.
Okay, anytime.
I'll go ahead and start.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked a lot about your support for Donald Trump during the debate. If President Biden wins in November, would you vote to certify the electors?
I want to make sure that our election is as clear and transparent as possible. The frustrations that we had in the previous election are certainly concerning, and we need to make sure that those are corrected. So I will execute my congressional duties to the best of my ability to make sure that we do have a clean and certifiable election.
What are those issues from the previous election you just mentioned?
Yeah, when I talk to voters throughout the trail, there are concerns about chain of custody in terms of when I cast my vote, when it's counted, and how that tally is stored. So I think there are concerns in terms of chain of custody and overall election polling and watching and so forth. Those would be issues that, if I have the opportunity to help clean up the election process, it would be making sure that we solidify and improve our chain of custody issues in voting.
Mr. Jenkins, one of the themes from this debate is what it looks like to achieve wins for your team or your constituents and being a team player in that sense. Would you ever vote for a bill that included things you supported that you considered wins and things that you considered concessions to the other side or the other team or viewpoints you disagree with?
Yeah, great question. So I'm certainly not naive to the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect bill. But when it comes to conservative Republican values, like making sure that we are actually cutting the government, we're not calling a cut 8 pounds instead of 10. That's Washington, D.C. math. So yes, I would vote no for a bill that has things in it that I want, but has more things that I don't want. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's whether things you want outweigh the things you don't want. That would be the calculus you're doing.
Not necessarily. If there are things in there like sending millions of dollars to defend the border of another nation when we're not sending that to our own border, which is a higher priority, then that's where I need to say no. We need to make sure that we're passing policies and funding that support our agenda, our conservative Republican agenda, not the minority's agenda.
You did, I believe you said you were opposed to a recent immigration bill that would have sent money to our border. You talked about it. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you said it helped undocumented immigrants with aid, but it did have money for security. Could you explain your position on that bill? It seems like that would be a bill that you would support based on your previous answer. Yeah, we need to get back to what was actually working before Joe Biden came into office. Remain in Mexico. Let's actually put that back in place. End catch and release. End stopping a quick process of an illegal immigrant and then kicking them off into our country with the promise of coming back for a court date in 4 or 5 years. We need to turn off those incentives that are serving to attract the mass illegal immigration. And I believe that the current legislation that was proposed does not do that, just by the fact that a majority of Republicans would not support that as well. So would you have voted against that? Yes. Yeah. Thank you. We do not need more government. We need leadership. We need leadership that will actually stand up, different kind of leadership. The leadership that doesn't say, hey, it's okay to have 2,500 illegal immigrants come in the country before we decide to turn off the faucet. That's not the type of leadership that the Americans are demanding from us.
Representative Malloy has responded to Senator Lee's support of you over her by saying essentially that she's her own politician, so she doesn't vote according to how he votes. Are there any instances in which you disagreed with how Senator Lee has voted, or in which you think you might disagree with his policy stances?
Yeah, so certainly I'm being hired to represent the constituents of the 2nd District, to make sure that I vote and represent their interest. I have been very grateful and respectful of Senator Lee, and I'm supportive of his current legislation as well. I will align myself with Senator Lee all day, every day, before I will ever align myself with the minority and all of the Democrats, like my opponent has done, not once, but twice. My voters are hiring me to stand with conservative, Republican, Utah leaders, and that's Senator Lee. And I will align myself with him before I ever step away from the majority of Republicans and align myself with the Democrats. That's the type of alignment that I'm looking for.
Do you feel like that alignment hurts your negotiating power going into discussions with Democrats if you come from a position? Do you feel like Senator Lee has negotiated well in budget discussions?
So an important distinction there. Sometimes when you have to vote no, you're actually voting yes to our agenda, to our policies, what we're being hired to do. So I think that when you negotiate from a position of strength that actually allows the majority in our agenda to have a chance at winning. When we don't begin from that position, then we're negotiating from a position of surrender. And just a brief example, so I'm drawing upon my experience in working with actual tribal chiefs. When I spent time in combat in Afghanistan, I literally had to sit and negotiate with tribal chiefs who didn't look like me, didn't speak like me, didn't act like me, and certainly had different objectives. But I had to make sure that I gained their relationship of trust, that I could work with them so that my mission could succeed, but theirs as well. And that comes from negotiation, not compromise. So, for example, if they asked, hey, we need to have 47 rifles and cannons in our village to have security, well, I didn't just give them everything they asked for. I said no, but I helped them provide security in other ways. That's the type of negotiating and relationship building that I've done and that I will do in Washington, D.C.
Representative Malloy has been in the seat for just 6 months. Why not step into this competition during the special election? Why file to run just after she won and before she began her term?
Yeah, great question. And that comes up often. At the time that Chris Stewart stepped down and that process started to unfold, I literally just began a new civilian job. And I'm a national director, and my team is across the nation. So I had 4 months of onboarding while this was starting to take effect. I had never planned or saw myself as a member of Congress. So when this kicked off, I was not thinking, oh, I got to run for Congress. But if that idea had been there and was starting to germinate, I wouldn't have been able to do it because I was now having to start a new job. So I was a precinct chairman at the time. I was a state delegate. I'm a senior military veteran. So I thought I'll do my best as a precinct chairman, as a state delegate, and get involved and support the delegates, go to the debates. And as that process started to unfold, I saw that we can and must do better. And then certainly once Congresswoman Malloy won and I started to see her voting record and the results that we were getting, that was the tipping point for me to test the waters, see that there was a positive result, and then file to run.
If you were to win the primary and then general election in November, and there was an opportunity to join the House Freedom Caucus in the House, is that something you would be interested in? Is that the kind of lawmaker in the U.S. House of Representatives that you would consider to be an ally and part of your coalition there?
Yes, with an important distinction that the House Freedom Fund has endorsed me already and are helping. But I will never outsource my thinking and my voting and my position to anyone. The House Freedom Caucus votes in alignment with how I plan to vote and how I would like to vote 98% of the time. So when we are in alignment, I will certainly vote with in favor of their positions, and I hope to be a teammate with them. So yes, to answer your question, yeah. Okay.
Where do you think, you talked a lot about Representative Malloy's votes on, big spending bills, omnibus bills. Where do you think there is any room for compromise with Democrats? As we've talked a lot about how it would be a slim majority and minority for Republicans in Congress.
Yes, certainly, and there has to be. Our founding fathers intended for our government to be a body of negotiation. But there's a key difference between negotiating and compromise. So an example with the warrantless wiretaps, FISA. There was negotiation that happened there. We need to reform FISA. And the primary reform there was to require a warrant if you're going to access U.S. person data in the FISA database. But what we got was a compromise that goes against the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. That's when I have to stand up and others, like Jim Jordan, like Thomas Massie, like Senator Lee, and say, no, we are not going to compromise on our Fourth Amendment. What happened there was Celeste Malloy compromised, saying, hey, we're going to have 56 new rules that the federal government will now have to adhere to. We're going to allow the Fox to continue to guard the hen house with more rules because they've continued to be disobedient and break rules throughout the 2 decades plus that FISA's been around. So let's trust them now. That's where I won't compromise. That's where the negotiation stops. That's an example of I'll negotiate within the protected boundaries of the Constitution, but when I'm being pulled off to compromise on something like FISA, that's where I say no. That's where it stops.
You mentioned Washington, D.C. math, talking about spending bills, gaining 8 pounds when you expected to gain 10. You might prefer to gain 0, but would you vote for a bill that, got 8 pounds rather than 10 or 15 or whatever that looks like?
No. No, the American government and the American people are tired of generational debt. They're tired of deficit spending. They're looking for leaders who will actually stand up and control the government spending. And a key distinction to make there is we are not required to fund the government. We are required to control spending. If that controlled spending actually funds the priorities of the Americans that are hiring us to execute their intentions and their desires, then that's what we do. It's not just give out everything that the bureaucracy demands or wants. We actually need to control that. And that begins with saying no, so that we can say yes to less inflation, less debt.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Good to see you, Rick. I don't know that I know everyone. Let me wet my whistle real quick.
I have to answer as if I'm my opponent.
Are we all ready?
Yep, we're cranked up.
So let's begin.
Congresswoman Malloy, one of the major themes.
Wait, they haven't started rolling yet.
Who's rolling?
We now know the first question is addressed to you.
Okay, now? Okay. I guess we're clear.
Representative Malloy, one of the major themes of that debate between yourself and your opponent was what it looks like to achieve wins for your team in Congress.
Yeah.
And there was lots of accusations leveled against you of maybe you failing to meet that bar. Could you just respond to that in a very direct way of maybe what that opponent gets wrong when it comes to what it means to achieve wins for the conservative Republican team or just for your CD2 constituents in Congress?
Yeah, so it's really easy when you're a first-time candidate, which I was last year, to make promises and to have the idea that if you were there, you would have done something better. It's naive, and when you're actually in office, one person can't get everything they want. One person can have a lot of influence, but in order to have a lot of influence, you've got to be able to work with other people. So angry talking points and hyperbole and hardline stances aren't really a formula for winning, but they do sound really nice on a campaign flyer.
Representative Malloy, you were working with Representative Stewart when the votes came up to certify the 2020 electors. I asked your opponent this as well, and if President Biden wins again in November, you said you're supporting Donald Trump, but if he wins, would you vote to certify the electors?
Yeah, states certify their own elections. I don't think it's the job of Congress to overturn what a state says their vote totals are.
So would you certify those results that the state send in?
Yeah, sorry. I started with yes. I thought that was clear, but yes.
Thank you.
Do you want an actual fun story so you have something to write about? This medallion that I'm wearing belonged to my great-grandma, who won it in a high school debate competition at North Cache High School in 1926. And her fondest dream was to go to college, but the Great Depression prevented her from doing that. And she was really big on education all of her life. I knew her when I was a little girl. She used to give me ice cream cones when I would go to visit her. But last year for Christmas, just 6 months ago, my grandma, her daughter, gave me this so that I can hang it in my office. I don't have it mounted yet. It's going to hang in my office to remind me of how far we've come, that my great-grandma was a debate champion in her high school but didn't get to go to college. And here I am, her great-granddaughter, and I have a college degree, I have a law degree, and I'm a member of Congress. And I think that would have just blown her mind. And I'm excited to have this with me in this debate, and I'm excited to have it with me in my office.
Senator Lee is obviously attempting to exercise more influence in Utah congressional primaries than he has in the past. And he is very vocal about his positions, and I'm wondering if you think his attempts to influence the House delegation's vote in Congress is crossing some sort of line, or if there's always that dialogue between House delegation and Senate delegation. And the question in my mind is whether, if Colby Jenkins were to enter the House, whether there would be an undue influence there between this Senate representative and the House.
Utah has 6 representatives on the federal level, and the state needs 6 individual thinkers making the decisions that they think are best for the people of Utah. And my plan next Congress is to continue to be an independent thinker and make decisions on how I vote and what I do based on what's best for the people of Utah. That being said, I'm also going to keep working with Senator Lee because we both want to do what's best for Utah. So we're going to get through this primary, and we're going to keep working together as a delegation to do what's best for the people we represent, because that's the responsible thing to do.
Representative Malloy, you mentioned that you wouldn't pass up the chance to vote to restrict abortion nationally if it came up.
Yeah.
If votes came up to restrict contraception or in vitro fertilization, where would you fall on those?
I am definitely in favor of in vitro fertilization. That is a pro-life choice. I have a lot of friends and relatives who wouldn't be here without in vitro fertilization. I'm also in favor of women having access to contraceptives.
Is there any, is that all contraceptives? Where do you fall in Plan B?
I'm in favor of women having options for contraception. I'm not prepared to answer every drug out there right now, but I'm pro-life. That includes giving women options.
A big part of this debate was discussions about the national debt and spending. Yeah. You explained your position and why you voted for the recent spending bills. But I wonder if you could address his accusation, his claims that you're using Washington math, that the deficit wasn't actually decreased with these most recent spending bills. If you could just talk about that.
Yeah, my response to that is that Mike Johnson did a heck of a good job negotiating. When it's him in the room with a Democrat Senate and a Democrat White House, we came out with appropriations bills that were actual cuts, not Washington math. And we got some really important policy wins in those bills. And we broke the parity between defense and non-defense spending. Those are all important conservative wins. And there's some other things that keep getting glossed over that are really important, like that we defunded UNRWA, the organization that helped Hamas invade Israel, one of our closest allies. That's a big win. We've been funding UNRWA for years. So I don't know how he defines Washington math, but I mean, it's a campaign tactic. When you're running against an incumbent, you have to find something you dislike about the incumbent. You have to find a way to differentiate yourself from the incumbent. I can stand on my record.
Your opponent and yourself debated over the meaning of leadership.
Yeah.
And Senator Lee and Colby Jenkins have often said that leadership is a no vote. And I'm sure you would agree with that in some instances. When is leadership a no vote, a perpetual no vote, and when does leadership mean a difficult yes vote?
Yeah, well, I think leadership means knowing when to vote no and knowing when to vote yes. Good leaders make tough decisions on behalf of the people that they are responsible to. I'm responsible to the people of the 2nd District. So I've had to take some tough votes, like voting to fund the government, when the other option was a shutdown. And the way we come out of every shutdown is a big omnibus spending bill. So I knew there would be conservatives who would be in favor of a shutdown. I also knew if I made that choice, we'd end up spending more money. So leadership is doing what's best for the people you represent, even when it's not the most popular thing, and even when you know some of your friends are going to criticize you for it. And then you have to marry that tough choice up with transparency and accountability to the people you represent. And that's what I've been trying to model as a member of Congress. I took a tough vote on the omnibus bill. 24 hours later, I was on a stage in Washington County at a Republican convention explaining my rationale for that vote to the people that I represent.
Representative Malloy, you have only worked under the Biden administration. If Trump were to be elected, what are some of the big policy changes you would like to push from Congress, and especially concerning public lands where a lot of your professional background is?
That is the best question I've been asked today. Thank you for that. I would love to push for some major permitting reform and some major changes in how agencies interact with the legislative branch and with the public. I mentioned briefly in the debate, if the Supreme Court overturns Chevron deference, that opens the door to a whole new world of cutting red tape and bureaucracy from our government. We've only increased bureaucracy for the last 80 years, and I think now is the time that we're ready. We're ready as a country. We're ready as a Congress. It's a bipartisan issue that we can go in and take out a lot of those layers of bureaucracy that just cost the taxpayers time and money. And especially here in Utah, where the federal government manages the majority of our land, we have so many layers of government approvals for all of the decisions that our local governments are making, that it would really increase our quality of life to strip out a lot of that bureaucracy, and it would really decrease the amount of money we're spending on federal agencies.
Are there any specific examples of places in Utah where people would see how that would impact them? Or
yeah, so we talked about the Northern Corridor. That route is actually considered in the 2009 lands bill. Congress actually did weigh in on that one and told the Secretary of Interior to work with the state of Utah, Washington County, and St. George City to find a route. And that was in 2009. It's 2024, and we're still standing here talking about it. And we're still standing here talking about it because agencies keep dragging their feet. They have that ability in our current permitting environment, and they shouldn't. When Congress says that something is allowed, agencies should have to defer to Congress, not the other way around. And I think if Chevron gets overturned, then we're in that world. That's when Congress will have to step up and do a more thorough job when we write bills, but we'll also be making more immediate decisions. And we're accountable. I'm standing here. I did a debate today. I'm talking to the media today. If I'm making decisions that are bad for the people of Utah, they know how to hold me accountable. But if you go to St. George right now and you talk to somebody in transportation planning and say, who's responsible for the delays on the Northern Corridor, they don't know who to call. They don't know who to hold accountable, and they don't have the ability to go to the ballot box and throw them out.
That sounds like a lot more responsibility for Congress if the
Yeah.
Supreme Court rules that way. Given the division and the partisanship that we've seen recently, all the gridlock, is Congress ready and capable to step up to the plate to handle all these questions?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think this is something we can actually do even in a narrowly divided Congress, and I'll tell you why. I sit on two committees, small business, and transportation and infrastructure. And what I've seen in both of those committees is people on both sides of the aisle signaling that they're sick and tired of federal agencies being able to drag their feet and slow down things that local governments need and that Congress has already said we need. And so I think it's a bipartisan issue. I think it's just abundantly clear at this point that we have way more federal government than we need. And I think we can work across the aisle and across the Capitol between the Senate and the House to start implementing some of these changes that we clearly need.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.